Welcome to Washington in Focus. I'm Carlene Johnson, and along with me today is the Center Square's investigative reporter, TJ Martinell, who has been looking into some pretty dramatic changes and decisions made by Washington lawmakers during the recently concluded legislative session to the state's public pension system, which was a model for much of the nation, but now we might be the outlier. TJ, set this up for us.
Yeah, so Washington State's public pension system is actually one of the best funded in the entire nation, and it's set to be fully funded by 2027. Now, for people who don't know a whole lot about how pension systems work and how the pension funding system operates, you have actuarial assumptions that are used to calculate how much the employer, which is a state agency or local government, whoever the public employee is working for, determines how much that they contribute. And then on top of that, the state legislature may or may not, depending on how much is needed, contribute through the operating budget into funding the pension system. And those assumptions among them are the assumed rate of return annually on the investments made. So the money that is taken from the contributions from the state level and through the employers, it goes into an investment. And so the state investment board invests all these things. And then there's an assumption that you're going to make so much money every single year. And the assumption determines how much money the state's going to have to contribute. So, until recently, it was 7%, which is, by the way, an incredibly optimistic percentage compared to what is allowed in the private sector. Private sector has way more restrictions where they can't assume more than the U.S. Treasury bond amount, which is, so it's basically saying the Treasury bonds, it has a 4% accrued interest annually. You can't set an assumed rate higher than that.
And let me interrupt for a second, just so folks can understand. So you don't want to, and by the way, we're talking about like teachers, firefighters, other public employees, right? But we don't want to assume a higher rate of return on the investment because these are constitutionally protected pension programs, right? We're going to pay these people once they retire, whatever this is, whether we've got the rate of return we expected or not.
Right. So they have to pay them the amount that under the pension plan. And there were two pension plans that closed in the 70s that were the primary reason why our pensions were underfunded. I'm not entirely sure what was going on, but it seems like they were incredibly generous packages. And so that's why, I mean, they closed in the that you could not enter the program or the pension plan starting 50 years ago, and yet it's still causing issues with our pension plan.
And that's what they refer to as like PERS 1 and TERS 1, right? You've got, and those plans have long since been closed because they were way too generous, as you mentioned.
Yeah. Right. So our assumed rate of return was 7%. The state legislature passed a bill, it's Senate Bill 5357, that increases the assumed rate of return to 7.25%. Now, and that's for all plans except law enforcement officers and firefighters plan 2. And this may not seem a lot, but it's kind of, I think the best way of putting it is if you take out an $80,000 loan with a 7% interest rate and it's increased instead to 7.25%, that's not going to be a whole lot. But if you take out an $8 billion loan and you change the percentage point by a quarter, right? That's going to be significant. The significance of the percentage change is really proportional to the amount that we're talking about. And we're talking about billions of dollars here. So what this means is the state isn't going to have to contribute as much money as it otherwise would into the pension plan. So it's going to be, one could argue it's a cost saving factor. Here's the problem. The biggest problem is, what if they're wrong? Because this is the first plan in the entire nation of all the states.
Right.
The first pension plan to change their assumed rate of return and increase it since the Great Recession, which for those of us, it may not seem like it was a long time ago, but it actually was a significant amount of time. We're talking over a decade here. So this is where we're at in terms of they've created a plan where the funding is based off of an incredibly optimistic view of the economic prosperity moving forward. But if they're wrong, that means that they are not contributing as much as they should have actually been. And that's
the whole goal now to change this system and not put in as much as we have been, assuming there's going to be a really big rate of return, is so that we can fund some other priorities ultimately. Is that not the case?
I mean, it depends on how they argue it. They could say we're saving money or we're spending that money elsewhere. But the reality is whatever they're doing with the money, they're putting less of it in the pension plan than they otherwise would have to.
This seems to be kicking the can down the road. I mean, I know you included in your story on this at thecentersquare.com some statements from the Reason Foundation. They look into pension programs, and Ryan Frost, their pension expert, you included some comments from him. I spoke to him as well, and he said that there's no other state that's actually raised their expected summary of return since 2008. They've only reduced it, and now we're raising it. So we're an outlier big time. And he said he'd be shocked if we don't end up in a really difficult situation just a few years down the line.
Yeah. And what's interesting is even the Office of the State Actuary warned in the bill's fiscal note that the reduction in short-term pension funding means the retirement system will have fewer assets to weather negative economic environments in the future. So if there is an economic downturn...
They didn't listen to him, though. They didn't listen to that.
Let's put it in perspective here. So the legislature is already dealing with and has dealt with a multi-billion-dollar budget shortfall in the operating budget. And that's without a economic downturn that's at a time when the state has record revenue levels. If the state or the nation experiences an economic recession that hits the investments and the rate of return is nowhere near 7%, not only do they have a budget shortfall that they're going to have to close in the operating budget, they're also going to have to come up with money to fund the pension system with assets that they don't have because they weren't investing at the time.
And because it's constitutionally protected, guaranteed, and we've got a flood of new retirees coming in, right? They're going to start dipping into this even more. The burden then falls on taxpayers because local governments, taxpayers have to come up with extra money every year to try and make sure that those folks are getting their monthly pension checks. I mean, it's a no-brainer to think, wow, if we're not putting in as much now, yay us, we're saving money, but then we don't make the 7.25% investment return, we're screwed.
Well, and this is, I think it's easy for people to see how this is going to be portrayed or framed if that were to happen, is they're simply going to say, if we don't pass this new tax, and it's going to be, framed as a tax on the wealthy. If we don't pass this tax on the wealthy, make them pay their fair share, this elderly couple is not going to get their retirement check in the mail after loyally serving the state.
You just wrote the ad for that whole campaign, TJ.
It's not hard to see how this is going to be, how this will go down, where they'll just say, we need to put a tax on the wealthy who are not paying their fair share and can take this burden, for some, and they'll have an ad with some firefighter who's retired and he's got health problems and he needs to pay his medical bill and he doesn't have money because his check's not in the mail because we didn't pass this tax or something like that. But the reality is, but we're just calling it now. The legislature has chosen to assume a higher rate of return than any other state in the nation on its retirement plans as a way of saving money in the short term. But if they got to pay it in the long term, and
even more,
it's not going to be them. It's going to be taxpayers who are going to pay for it.
Yeah, it's infuriating to sit in on those public hearings, as I did several of them for this bill you referenced in your story, TJ, and hear even GOP members of those committees questioning staffers to run the numbers. Okay, so again, the state actuary office says yada yada. And so is this really what we're doing? And they're saying, don't do this. And yet supporters of the bill are marching on ahead, and the staffers would have to concede and go, yeah, we would be the only state doing this. And so it's, if you're not willing to listen to logic and reason, you're not willing to listen to logic and reason. I mean, that's just the way it is.
I think they know what they're doing. They're taking a gamble of that the state's economy will continue to grow, that the national economy is going to continue to grow, but most importantly, that the investments that have already been made are going to continue to receive the growth that they assume. They're putting a lot of eggs in one basket, and that basket.
They don't have any evidence that rate of return is going to happen.
It's really remarkable that they're doing that at a time when this was around the time this bill was being considered, and they were passing these bills, is when Trump was imposing all these tariffs and the stock market was going down, and it's gone back up since then. But there was a lot of uncertainty over how that was going to go down, and how long were the tariffs going to be in place, and how long was the economy going to, the stock market going to go down. And so you think that they would say, hey, we maybe want to put the brakes on this until we figure out what the trade deals are going to look like and what the economy is going to look like. But instead they just say it kind of speaks to how what they actually think or what they're hoping, so. Well,
yeah, I think, I don't know, maybe I'm just cynical. It seems in some ways that, they know full well what they're doing, and it just.
But I mean, they're not going to have to pay for it if they.
That's right.
If someone, if there's a unfunded liability that needs to be plugged in terms of funding, there's always taxpayers to go to, and they have they don't have to go to taxpayers and ask them for money. They can just pass a law saying you have to give us money.
Yeah, well, that makes it easy. That's so efficient. So efficient. Oh man. Well, I really appreciate your writing on this. I don't think that this got enough attention during the legislative session that it deserved. So I appreciate that you wrote this up. And for our readers that want to look more into this and follow up other stories that TJ covers, thecentersquare.com. For now, along with TJ Martinell, I'm Carlene Johnson. This has been Washington in Focus.